The first indication that something had gone wrong was not the statement itself. It was the reaction inside the room after it ended. At 8:42 a.m. in Brussels, several European trade ministers stopped speaking mid-sentence as aides quietly passed updated briefing notes across a long oak conference table. One German official lowered his glasses and stared at a line highlighted in yellow. A French energy advisor leaned back in silence. Phones began vibrating almost simultaneously along the eastern side of the room. Across the hallway, television producers were already rewriting their headlines. Because overnight had done something Washington did not believe Canada would actually do. He had begun repositioning Canada toward Europe. Not rhetorically, not symbolically, structurally. And somewhere inside the White House complex, officials around suddenly realized the negotiation they thought they controlled was beginning to move beyond them. Markets understood the implication immediately. The Canadian dollar rose 1.8% against the US dollar before North American trading desks had fully opened. European industrial indexes climbed on expectations of expanded transatlantic energy coordination. Shipping firms in Rotterdam and Antwerp saw abnormal volume projections before noon. By lunchtime, analysts at two major sovereign wealth funds were circulating internal notes containing the same phrase, North American strategic realignment risk. The problem was larger than the deal itself. For decades, the assumption inside Washington had been simple. Canada could disagree with the United States. It could complain. It could delay negotiations. But ultimately, geography would force alignment. The American market was too large. The supply chains too integrated. The military architecture too interconnected. That assumption had quietly shaped 3 generations of U.S. trade strategy. Then the pressure campaign began. It started with tariffs. Then came threats against automotive imports, then aluminum, then softwood lumber, then energy leverage. Each announcement arrived with the same theatrical pattern: cameras first, institutions second. Public escalation became negotiation strategy. The spectacle itself became leverage. But inside Ottawa, the response was remarkably restrained. No emotional press conferences, no retaliatory political theater, no dramatic nationalist speeches. Instead, Carney's government began holding closed-door meetings with European Commission officials, NATO economic planners, and central banking advisors from Frankfurt, Paris, and Amsterdam. Quiet meetings, technical meetings, the kind markets often notice before politicians do. And that distinction mattered, because markets can survive conflict. They rarely survive unpredictability. Within weeks, European diplomats began noticing a subtle but unmistakable shift in Canadian language. Canadian ministers stopped referring to North American dependence and began using phrases like strategic diversification and supply chain resilience. Trade negotiators started discussing Atlantic corridor investments with unusual urgency. Defense analysts began referencing Arctic logistics partnerships with Scandinavian governments. Individually, these signals seemed minor. Together, they formed a pattern, and patterns are what institutional investors watch most carefully. By early autumn, analysts at BlackRock, UBS, and several pension giants were privately discussing whether Canada was attempting the most significant geopolitical repositioning in its modern history. Not away from America entirely. That was impossible. The economies were too intertwined, but partially away, far enough to create leverage, far enough to reduce vulnerability, far enough to change the negotiation permanently. Inside Washington, the initial reaction was dismissive. Several administration officials reportedly viewed the European outreach as bluffing. The logic appeared straightforward. Europe was economically strained, politically fragmented, and increasingly dependent on American defense architecture. Canada, they believed, had nowhere else to go. But economic systems do not operate on pride. They operate on incentives, and Europe suddenly had incentives. Germany needed stable energy partners outside Russian influence. France wanted strategic industrial coordination. The Netherlands sought Atlantic shipping expansion. Scandinavian governments wanted Arctic security cooperation. Meanwhile, investors desperately wanted something even more valuable: predictability. That was the moment officials realized the crisis was becoming irreversible. Because the issue was no longer tariffs. The issue had become sovereign credibility. In private diplomatic cables later referenced by several European newspapers, officials described Canada as stable under pressure, while simultaneously describing Washington as escalatory and transactionally volatile. The wording was careful, diplomatic language usually is, but the meaning was unmistakable. Institutional trust was beginning to migrate, and institutional trust takes decades to build and minutes to damage. At a closed economic forum in Zurich, one senior currency strategist reportedly summarized the situation in 11 words. Canada is acting like a central bank. Washington is acting like television. The quote spread rapidly through financial circles. Not publicly, quietly. The dangerous observations always do. Meanwhile, the White House intensified its rhetoric. Public comments grew sharper. Trade threats became broader. Several American commentators framed Canada's European outreach as disloyalty. Television panels began discussing economic retaliation openly. Political pressure escalated because political pressure was familiar, but Carney continued responding the same way, calmly, technically, institutionally. At one press briefing in Ottawa, reporters repeatedly attempted to provoke confrontation. One journalist asked whether Canada was abandoning America. Another demanded direct criticism of Trump's trade posture. Carney paused for nearly 4 seconds before answering. Canada is expanding strategic options in a changing world. That was all he said. No escalation, no insult, no spectacle. But in Frankfurt, bond traders immediately understood the message. Strategic options meant leverage, and leverage cuts both ways. The real damage had not yet begun, because while television networks focused on political drama, a far more important process was unfolding underneath the headlines. European procurement ministries had started quietly altering long-term industrial assumptions. Canadian energy corridors suddenly appeared in infrastructure modeling. Defense planners began discussing Atlantic manufacturing redundancy in the event of future American political instability, not military instability, political instability. There is a difference. Military systems can be managed through deterrence. Political unpredictability infects contracts, investment models, supply chain assumptions, and sovereign planning itself. And sovereign planning is where real power lives. 1 month later, a meeting inside Brussels changed the atmosphere entirely. The room was sealed, no cameras allowed. Officials from 7 European governments attended alongside Canadian economic representatives. According to later leaks summarized by multiple diplomatic sources, discussions centered around expanded energy integration, critical mineral coordination, and reduced dependency on politically volatile trade frameworks. At one point, an Italian delegate reportedly asked whether Canada was prepared for extended strategic divergence with Washington. The silence afterward reportedly lasted nearly 10 seconds. Then one Canadian official answered quietly, "We are preparing for all scenarios." Phones started vibrating again. Because somewhere across the Atlantic, markets sensed the architecture shifting. The S&P 500 remained relatively stable publicly, but sector volatility began widening beneath the surface. Automotive suppliers exposed to cross-border uncertainty saw unusual repricing. Industrial transportation firms adjusted long-term guidance. Currency hedging activity increased sharply among firms dependent on U.S.-Canada trade corridors. The market was not panicking, it was recalculating. That is often more dangerous. Panic is emotional. Recalculation is structural, and structural shifts are difficult to reverse. Inside the White House, frustration reportedly intensified. Several officials believed Canada was attempting to internationalize a bilateral dispute. Others argued Europe was exploiting the tension to weaken American negotiating dominance. Intelligence briefings warned that prolonged escalation could unintentionally accelerate European economic autonomy efforts already underway after earlier geopolitical shocks. But by then, the emotional momentum had already overtaken strategic patience. Trade wars are expensive. Ego-driven trade wars become historic. At a campaign-style rally in Ohio, Trump publicly criticized Canadian leadership while promising tougher economic measures if negotiations failed to respect American interests. The crowd cheered loudly. Television clips spread globally within minutes. Yet in financial centers, the reaction was colder. Treasury analysts focused on one issue only: uncertainty duration. Because businesses can adapt to high costs, they struggle to adapt to unstable rules. That distinction began reshaping investment behavior almost immediately. A major European pension consortium delayed billions in North American industrial exposure pending political stabilization indicators. Several logistics firms accelerated contingency planning for Atlantic shipping diversification. Insurance markets quietly adjusted risk models tied to North American trade disruption scenarios. Again, none of this looked dramatic on television. Most historic shifts never do at first. They begin inside spreadsheets, inside procurement models, inside closed-door meetings where officials stop assuming the future will resemble the past. And then suddenly the old assumptions disappear all at once. That winter, a private dinner in Paris reportedly accelerated everything. French finance officials hosted Canadian representatives alongside executives from major European energy firms. The discussion centered on liquefied natural gas coordination, critical mineral partnerships, and industrial resilience frameworks extending into the next decade. According to later reporting from diplomatic correspondents, one executive described Canada as the most politically stable strategic supplier in the Atlantic sphere. The phrase circulated rapidly. Stability, predictability, institutional continuity. These sound like boring words. In financial systems, they are priceless, especially during geopolitical fragmentation. Back in Washington, however, the situation was becoming increasingly difficult to control narratively. The original pressure strategy had assumed Canada would eventually return to negotiations from a weaker position. Instead, Canada appeared to be widening its options while remaining publicly restrained. That restraint became psychologically powerful because emotionally reactive systems often become more unstable when confronting disciplined opposition. Every escalation that failed to produce submission instead increased the perception of diminishing leverage. Markets noticed, allies noticed, even adversaries noticed. At NATO headquarters, several defense officials reportedly expressed concern that economic fragmentation inside the Western alliance was beginning to create broader strategic vulnerabilities. Intelligence assessments warned that geopolitical competitors were closely monitoring transatlantic divisions for opportunities to expand influence in energy, shipping, and infrastructure sectors. The problem was no longer bilateral. The problem had become systemic. And systemic pressure changes how institutions behave. By spring, the consequences had spread beyond trade. European banks increased exposure to Canadian sovereign instruments, while slightly reducing projections tied to politically volatile U.S. policy scenarios. Energy planners accelerated discussions around non-American strategic redundancy. Canadian-European university and technology partnerships expanded quietly but rapidly. It was not an alliance against America. That was the critical misunderstanding repeated constantly on television. It was an alliance against unpredictability. There is a difference. One afternoon in London, a senior market strategist appeared on Bloomberg and delivered a sentence that caused unusual silence across trading desks. Global capital is beginning to price political temperament itself. That sentence mattered, because once markets begin pricing temperament, political risk stops being temporary. It becomes embedded, and embedded perceptions are extraordinarily difficult to unwind. Meanwhile, Carney maintained the same public posture almost obsessively. No triumphalism, no ideological grandstanding, no emotional attacks. Meetings remained technical, statements remained measured, negotiations remained institutional. Observers began noticing something unusual about the Canadian strategy. It was designed less to win headlines than to survive volatility. That distinction changed everything, because history repeatedly shows the same pattern. In periods of systemic stress, survival itself becomes leverage, and leverage attracts alignment. The turning point came during a tense multinational summit in Brussels, attended by finance ministers, defense officials, and trade negotiators from across the Atlantic Alliance. The atmosphere inside the conference hall reportedly shifted after updated economic projections were distributed, showing rising costs associated with prolonged North American trade instability. One page reportedly drew immediate attention: a projected 14% increase in strategic European investment into Canadian infrastructure over 5 years, not American infrastructure, Canadian infrastructure. Several officials reportedly exchanged glances immediately. One advisor later described the room as suddenly understanding the future at the same moment. Because investment projections are not just numbers, they are votes of confidence, and confidence is fragile. Late that evening, as motorcades departed through rain-soaked Brussels streets, phones inside multiple diplomatic vehicles reportedly lit up simultaneously with breaking alerts. Washington wanted renewed cooperation talks, not symbolic talks, urgent talks. Suddenly, the rhetoric changed. Public statements softened, trade language moderated. Officials began emphasizing shared prosperity and allied coordination. Television appearances grew less confrontational. Back-channel diplomacy accelerated rapidly, because by then, the strategic cost had become visible. The danger was no longer Canada leaving America behind. The danger was America teaching allies they needed alternatives. That realization altered the psychology of the negotiation completely. Power often mistakes size for durability, but durability depends on trust, and trust depends on predictability. For nearly a year, Washington had treated leverage as pressure. Carney had treated leverage as optionality. One strategy sought immediate concessions. The other sought reduced vulnerability. Markets eventually chose which model they trusted more, quietly, relentlessly, without emotion. That is how financial systems deliver judgment, and their judgments are often brutal precisely because they are unemotional. Inside Ottawa, officials reportedly understood something important before many commentators did. Canada did not need to defeat the United States. It simply needed to prove it had alternatives. That alone changed the balance, because dependence creates asymmetry. Options reduce it. The implications spread far beyond North America. In Tokyo, Seoul, Berlin, and Singapore, policymakers watched the confrontation carefully. Smaller allies around the world began asking uncomfortable questions about long-term strategic dependency on emotionally volatile political cycles. Central banks quietly expanded contingency modeling tied to geopolitical fragmentation scenarios. Defense ministries discussed industrial redundancy frameworks with growing urgency. The crisis had evolved into a case study, and the case study was being read globally. By the final phase of negotiations, the atmosphere had changed completely from the early confrontations. Gone were many of the theatrical threats. Gone was much of the public escalation. The tone became more cautious, more procedural, more institutional, because reality had intervened. Economic systems eventually force ideological performances to confront material consequences, always. Factories either receive components or they do not. Investors either trust sovereign behavior or they do not. Supply chains either function predictably or they fragment. The market does not care about applause, it cares about survivability. One senior European diplomat later summarized the entire crisis with remarkable precision during an off-record conversation in Vienna. The issue was never Canada. The issue was whether America still understood how alliances function. That observation lingered long after the meetings ended, because alliances are not maintained by size alone. They are maintained by reliability. And reliability is ultimately a behavioral pattern, not a slogan, not a speech, not a negotiation tactic, a pattern. By the time cooperation discussions formally resumed, the geopolitical landscape had already shifted beneath everyone involved. Europe had accelerated strategic diversification planning. Canada had expanded institutional leverage. Investors had repriced political volatility more aggressively than at any point in decades. Most importantly, allies had learned something new. The old assumptions were no longer guaranteed. That realization may ultimately become the most consequential part of the entire episode. Not the tariffs, not the speeches, not the headlines, the realization. Because once allies begin preparing for unpredictability instead of assuming stability, the architecture of global power begins quietly changing underneath existing institutions. And those changes tend to outlive administrations. The final meeting reportedly ended without celebration. No dramatic handshakes, no historic photographs, no triumphant speeches. just exhausted officials gathering folders in silence while aides checked phones for overnight market reactions. One Canadian advisor reportedly remained seated several moments longer than everyone else, reviewing updated investment projections under the dim conference lighting. Outside, motorcades disappeared into wet streets as cameras searched desperately for visible signs of victory. But the real story was no longer visible. It was structural. It lived inside altered assumptions, inside revised investment models, inside new diplomatic calculations, inside the growing realization that geopolitical power in the 21st century increasingly belongs not to the loudest actor in the room, but to the system most trusted when pressure arrives. And that was the moment many officials finally understood what had actually happened. Mark Carney had not tried to overpower Donald Trump. He had simply reduced Canada's vulnerability long enough for the rest of the world to notice. History often turns quietly at first: a delayed phone call, a changed investment forecast, a closed-door meeting in Brussels, a silence inside a negotiation room after someone realizes leverage has shifted. Then suddenly the old world no longer behaves the way everyone expected. And by the time political leaders fully recognize the change, markets have already moved on. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe my channel for daily updates.